Hey guys, tonight we drift into the soaked, shivering dawn of the Second Boer War. And trust me, you probably won't survive this charge. The sky is gray with gunpowder mist, and the ground beneath your boots squelches with mud and blood. Ahead, Highland Brigade soldiers in drenched tartan kilts slog through a flooded plain. Their rifles are heavy, their hearts heavier still. From a ridge barely visible through the fog, a line of Boer trenches flashes to life, rifle reports cracking in irregular bursts, each one a whip crack of death slicing the humid air. Shrapnel whines overhead. A bugle sounds, distorted by rain. Then comes that haunting moment of silence before chaos returns. You're in it now, wading forward as bullets flick the water around your knees like raindrops on glass. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're joining us from Johannesburg, Edinburgh, or anywhere in between, drop your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the field, heart pounding. The scene isn't from the Somme or Passchendaele, though it might as well be. This is South Africa, December 1899, 2 decades before the trenches of Europe. And yet, the mud smells the same, acrid, metallic, human. The Highland Brigade is part of a British force trying to storm Boer defenses near Magersfontein. The men advance with blind courage, expecting the enemy to be dug in on a hilltop. Instead, the Boers have burrowed into shallow trenches at the base of the slope, their Mausers hidden by thorn and earth. When the first volleys erupt, hundreds of Scots drop in seconds. The survivors dive flat, water soaking their greatcoats, their rifles clogged with sludge. You can almost taste the panic as officers shout orders that no one hears. Some break and run. Others crawl forward into death. It's senseless, desperate, and beautiful in that terrible way war always is when men believe they're serving honor. One soldier beside you clutches a miniature Bible. Another mutters, "They're ghosts, man. They're ghosts." You want to believe him, but those ghosts have deadly aim. The British Empire, at this moment, still believes itself invincible. Red banners flutter from Hong Kong to Halifax. Queen Victoria is in her twilight years, but her armies march on sunlight and duty. Against them stand rough, sunburned farmers on horseback. The Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers who traded windmills for the veld. They ride with cracked rifles, no uniforms, and an attitude that could scare the devil himself. Historians still argue whether Britain ever truly understood what it was fighting for here. Was it pride? Was it gold? Was it the idea of empire versus the stubborn spark of self-rule? Either way, tonight's chaos on this swampy plain is the price of miscalculation. Through the smoke, an officer named Wauchope, one of those tragic heroes history always remembers for dying bravely, tries to rally his men. "Forward, Highlanders!" he shouts. The answer is a ripple of rifle fire that cuts him down mid-word. The men hesitate, then lie flat, pinned for hours by relentless Boer sharpshooters. By noon, the field is a cemetery. The mud hides the bodies, but the tartan flashes tell the story. You shift perspective, rising above the battlefield, watching the ants of war from the clouds. Lines form and collapse. Horses bolt. Shells burst in muddy fountains. The British Army had arrived in South Africa, expecting quick glory, a small war against farmers with bad tempers. What it found instead was a people born to the saddle, molded by open country and terrifyingly accurate with a rifle. A quirky tidbit? Some Boers were so skilled they could hit a coin at 200 yards while resting their rifle on a fence post. Others wore leather bandoliers stitched by their wives filled with homemade bullets. Their commanders, men like Cronje and Delaray, knew every ravine and thorn bush of this land. The veld was their fortress, and you, yes you, are walking straight into their crossfire. As the day fades, the British fall back. The rain turns the ground into pudding. The wounded groan for medics who never come. Somewhere behind the lines, an army chaplain hums, "Abide with me." There's a strange serenity to it, as if the war itself has paused to catch its breath. This single battle at Magersfontein isn't just another colonial skirmish. It's a warning shot to the Empire. The Boers, against all odds, have bloodied Britain's nose. Newspapers back home can't quite process the humiliation. Editors call it a setback. Soldiers call it what it is: disaster. Over the next few weeks, 3 more British defeats will follow, in a stretch that journalists later nickname Black Week. But we'll get to that. For now, the only thing that matters is survival. You're lying belly down in the mud, fingers trembling around a Lee Enfield that's jammed again. A comrade tries to crawl toward a wounded friend and is struck dead before moving 3 feet. The smell of cordite mingles with wet earth. Above you, the Boers watch in eerie silence between volleys, invisible specters in felt hats. They don't shout, they don't charge. They simply wait for movement, and then shoot. At sunset, the Highland Brigade retreats. Of the thousands who began the morning's charge, hundreds remain. Some curse their luck, some pray, some joke in whispers just to stay sane. One private mutters that he'd rather face lions than Boers. You almost laugh, though it comes out as a cough. The next morning, British officers ride through the wreckage, their boots sinking into mud mixed with tartan and tragedy. The wounded are carried out in stretchers improvised from rifles and cloaks. Overhead, vultures circle, as if the sky itself has joined the war. And yet, even in defeat, the machinery of empire grinds forward. Orders are drafted, telegrams sent, excuses prepared for London. In drawing rooms far away, politicians will debate tactics over tea, while the men who fought here fade into hospital wards or graves. War, as always, has a way of turning human endurance into paperwork. Still, there's something hauntingly noble about this failure. The Highlanders march through hell for a patch of thorny scrub because they were told to, and sometimes that's enough. Duty doesn't always end in victory. It just ends when the bugles stop. Later, one surviving officer will describe the battle as walking blind into the mouth of the earth. Another will say, with grim humor, that the only thing wetter than the field was their morale. You can almost hear him laughing through his bandages. The broader world barely notices yet, but the Empire's myth of effortless dominance has cracked. The Boers have shown that courage and cunning can hold their own against regiments, rails, and rifles. It won't last forever, of course, but tonight, in this muddy corner of Africa, the Empire bleeds like any man. As the stars rise over the veld, you imagine the British campfires flickering weakly, smoke drifting into the night. Somewhere out there, a Boer commando sits polishing his rifle by moonlight, humming a psalm in Afrikaans. Both sides pray to the same God. Both wonder how long this will go on. You exhale, realizing the mud on your hands is history in disguise. Gritty, cold, and unrelenting. The war has only just begun. You wake the next morning to the brittle chill of dawn, and the battlefield has fallen silent. Crows peck at the edges of discarded gear. The Highlanders' charge, the very one you survived, has already become a legend, whispered in disbelief through the British camp. Yet beneath the bandages and mud, something deeper has broken. That illusion of effortless empire. But to understand how the British Army ended up bleeding into African soil, you have to rewind nearly 20 years to a different piece, one inked not on the battlefield, but on paper. After Britain's first clash with the Boers, the First Boer War, 1880 to 1881, came what politicians called the Pretoria Convention. It looked like a truce, smelled like a compromise, and aged like a trap. Britain, embarrassed by its earlier defeat at Majuba Hill, agreed to restore the South African Republic, also known as the Transvaal, to nominal independence. On paper, The Boers had their republic back. In reality, London kept its fingers deep in the pie, controlling external affairs, foreign policy, and anything else that mattered when flags started moving on maps. The Boers didn't forget the humiliation, but they accepted the treaty because they were farmers, not fools. They'd tasted victory once. They could wait for another chance. You can almost picture the Transvaal president, a bearded patriarch in a broad hat, signing the document with tight lips while his eyes say, "This isn't over." Historians still argue whether Britain ever intended to honor that independence. Some claim it was a political band-aid meant to quiet Parliament until the Empire found another excuse to reassert control. Others argue that both sides wanted peace, but neither trusted the other to keep it. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere between cynicism and wishful thinking. For a few years, peace held. Thin, suspicious. Like a calm bar before a thunderstorm, Boer farmers returned to their cattle, tending to the dry earth with the same patience that had carried their ancestors across the continent in ox-drawn wagons. They were a people forged in hardship, descendants of Dutch settlers, deeply religious, stubbornly independent, and fluent in the language of survival. But beneath that quiet, something restless stirred. You feel it, like a tremor in the soil. The empire hadn't gone away. It was simply biding its time. And time, as it turned out, would bring gold. One evening, a prospector panning a stream near the Witwatersrand, a ridge of white waters in the Transvaal, glimpsed something glittering in his pan. The year was 1886, and that speck of metal would rewrite southern Africa's fate. Within months, tents and shacks sprouted across the highveld like weeds after rain. Prospectors from every corner of the empire swarmed in, British, Australian, Canadian, chasing fortune with pickaxes and feverish dreams. You can almost hear the din, the clang of hammers, the hiss of steam, the drunken laughter of miners in makeshift taverns. The dusty settlement would soon earn a name, Johannesburg, and within a decade it would rival London in wealth, if not refinement. For the Boers, this invasion was a nightmare wrapped in progress. Their quiet republic was now swarming with outsiders, or as they called them, Uitlanders, outlanders. These were men who didn't speak their language, didn't share their faith, and didn't understand why the Bible needed to be quoted before breakfast. But they paid taxes, worked the mines, and demanded a voice in government. President Paul Kruger, the aging patriarch of the Transvaal, said no. And you can almost sympathize. Imagine a small, tight-knit farming nation suddenly outnumbered by foreigners with dynamite, greed, and British passports. Kruger saw them as agents of imperial control, Trojan horses in the guise of miners. His government refused them the vote, citing loyalty and culture. The Uitlanders, meanwhile, saw themselves as second-class subjects in a land they were enriching with sweat and shovels. Britain, naturally, took up their cause, but the cause had less to do with democracy and more to do with the shimmering veins of gold beneath Transvaal soil. In London's drawing rooms, men like Cecil Rhodes, Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, diamond magnate, and self-proclaimed prophet of empire, licked their lips. A British-controlled Transvaal would complete the dream, an unbroken chain of red on the map from Cape to Cairo. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Rhodes reportedly kept a globe with a red line stretching up Africa, marking the future path of British dominion. He'd spin it while sipping brandy, murmuring about the expansion of civilization. Some guests found it inspiring. Others found it creepy. You can decide which. By the early 1890s, tension hung thick as the dust on the Johannesburg streets. The Boers fortified their borders and bought modern rifles from Germany. British agents and journalists began painting Kruger's republic as backward and oppressive, priming public opinion for liberation. Everyone knew the fuse was burning. No one knew when it would reach the powder. You stand at a tavern counter in the Johannesburg twilight, overhearing miners argue politics over cheap beer. One shouts, "We pay the taxes, we built this town, and yet we can't vote." Another mutters, "The old man's afraid we'll take his country." Both are right in their own way. Historians still debate whether this rising tension was avoidable. Some say Kruger could have granted limited voting rights to wealthy foreigners, cooling tempers. Others argue it wouldn't have mattered. Britain wanted gold and control, not compromise. Either way, Pretoria's paper peace is dissolving, its ink running in the heat of greed and pride. And if you lean close, you can already hear the distant echo of gunfire, the sound of inevitability sharpening its aim. Far away in London, politicians reassure themselves that it won't come to war. They always do. Colonial squabbles are supposed to be tidy affairs, conducted by telegram and treaty. But Africa has a way of humbling empires. Its vastness swallows maps, and its people, Boer and Black alike, refuse to be neatly categorized. You step outside, the Johannesburg night humming with life. Steam whistles pierce the dark. From a nearby church, hymns drift through the dust. In the hills beyond, Boer sentries patrol under the southern stars, their silhouettes still and watchful. You realize the peace forged at Pretoria was never peace at all. It was a pause, a long, deep breath before the storm. As you turn toward the east, lightning flickers on the horizon, illuminating the veld. It looks like the flash of artillery, just for a second, then it's gone, leaving you with the uneasy sense that history, once again, is loading its rifle. The storm finally breaks, not with thunder, but with gold dust in the air. You're standing on a ridge above the Witwatersrand in the late 1880s, watching a horizon glimmer like powdered sunlight. From this ridge, everything seems to pulse with possibility. The mines, the tracks, the shantytowns swelling into cities. Yet beneath the surface, the very same glitter that promises fortune is eroding peace, grain by grain. By 1886, Johannesburg has exploded into life. You see ox wagons turned into stores, corrugated roofs clattering under summer storms, and streets where every language on earth is shouted over the roar of steam engines. Miners, some wearing bowler hats, others in torn khakis, line up outside pubs thick with dust and sweat. They're foreigners in a Boer republic that feels increasingly alien to them. The British call it opportunity. The Boers call it invasion. You trudge through the bustling market, the smell of coal smoke and fried dough mixing with the metallic tang of dynamite. At every stall, voices argue about claims, wages, and taxes. But the louder argument, the one carried on through newspaper editorials and government decrees, is over belonging. The Uitlanders, the British immigrants who flooded the Transvaal, want political representation. They pay nearly all the taxes, fund the infrastructure, and, being British, believe self-government comes with the price of admission. President Paul Kruger, a stoic, Bible-quoting patriarch with a beard like Moses and a handshake like an anvil, disagrees. He sees Johannesburg as a cancer, foreign, godless, and dangerous. You came for gold, he says, not for freedom. And you can understand his fear. The Transvaal had been born out of resistance, carved from wilderness by the Voortrekkers, those wagon-driving pioneers who fled British rule decades earlier. Now, after years of blood and hardship, their descendants watch English miners swagger through their streets, mocking their language and scoffing at their god. Historians still argue whether Kruger's government was protecting tradition or just protecting power. Some say he was a stubborn relic of the past. Others say he was the only man standing between the Boers and assimilation. What's clear is that his refusal to grant voting rights to the Outlanders hardened the lines between farmer and foreigner, settler and speculator. By 1890, the Transvaal is divided not just by fences, but by purpose. Johannesburg's skyline sprouts smokestacks, while Boer farms remain quiet and windblown. Each side sees the other as the future's enemy. Meanwhile, far to the south, in Cape Town, Cecil Rhodes watches the drama unfold like a chess player eyeing a weak opponent. Rhodes isn't just the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. He's an empire incarnate, a man who dreams in red ink and expansion routes. If you asked him what time it was, he'd probably tell you in longitude and imperial potential. A quirky tidbit? Rhodes once claimed he wanted to annex the planets if possible. That's not metaphor, it's in his writings. The man's ambition could have powered a locomotive. To Rhodes, the Boer republics are obstacles, inconvenient blank spots between British possessions. His dream, Cape to Cairo, one unbroken chain of British control, depends on removing those stubborn little republics that sit like thorns in the middle of the map. And now, thanks to the gold rush, he has a perfect moral pretext. Oppressed Englishmen needing rescue from Boer tyranny. He begins plotting, quietly at first. Secret meetings, telegrams disguised as business letters, funds funneled into reform committees in Johannesburg. By 1895, the pieces are almost in place. All Rhodes needs is a spark to ignite the powder, and that spark comes in the form of Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, a man as reckless as his name sounds. Jameson is Rhodes's friend, adventurer, and the sort of doctor who prescribes bullets more often than bandages. Together, they hatch what history will call the Jameson Raid, a plan so audacious and ill-timed it could have been scripted by a playwright with a grudge. The idea? Jameson will ride from Bechuanaland into the Transvaal with a small force of about 600 men, police, adventurers, volunteers. At the same time, pro-British reformers in Johannesburg will rise up in rebellion. Within days, the capital will fall, Kruger will be overthrown, and the British will sweep in to restore order. You can almost feel the arrogance oozing from the plan. It relies on speed, secrecy, and the assumption that the Boers are too slow to react. Unfortunately for Rhodes, secrecy is a luxury the British Empire has never been good at keeping. Word leaks. The uprising in Johannesburg fizzles before it begins, and Jameson's column, exhausted and outnumbered, is intercepted by Boer commandos near Doornkop. The raiders are captured, their surrender humiliatingly public. When news reaches London, the empire blushes scarlet. Rhodes is forced to resign, his political career in tatters. The raid, instead of liberating the Transvaal, unites the Boers in fury. You can imagine Kruger's satisfaction as he telegraphs his message to Queen Victoria. The Almighty has protected the right. Historians still debate just how much the British government knew. Some insist Rhodes acted alone, driven by greed and ego. Others argue that London quietly encouraged him, ready to denounce the raid only if it failed, which, of course, it did spectacularly. Either way, the outcome is clear. The Boers now know exactly what Britain wants, and they begin preparing for the inevitable. Kruger orders new rifles from Europe, artillery from Germany, and ammunition by the trainload. Fortifications rise around Pretoria. Volunteers drill on the veld under the blazing sun. The Transvaal's quiet farmers are transforming into soldiers. A British journalist visiting Pretoria around this time described it as a hive of calm fury. Everywhere he looked, men were stockpiling powder and prayer books. "It's the most polite revolution I've ever seen," he wrote. Meanwhile, in Cape Town, Rhodes sulks but doesn't repent. He famously says, "You may fire me, but you can't fire the dream." And he's right, the dream remains in the minds of British imperialists who see South Africa as unfinished business. You're standing now on the Johannesburg Ridge again, but the laughter of miners has dimmed. The taverns are quieter, the streets more watchful. Everyone knows the next blow will come not from a raid, but from an army. Far in the north, British troops begin massing near the borders, their khaki uniforms blending poorly with the red dust. The Boers respond by calling up commandos, citizen soldiers on horseback, each bringing his own rifle, his own horse, and his own stubborn will. They have no formal ranks, no marching bands, just grit and faith. The peace that began with the Pretoria Convention has withered completely. The ink that once symbolized compromise now feels like dried blood on parchment. As night settles over the Rand, you picture Kruger kneeling by lamplight in his study, reading from the Psalms. Outside, a courier waits on horseback, the wind tugging at his coat. Within days, the next telegram he carries will be an ultimatum, the one that finally breaks the silence and sends two nations tumbling into war. For now, though, the only sound is the wind moving through the veld. It whistles through broken fences and half-built mines, a lonely note that seems to say, "Prepare." You hear the church bells of Pretoria before you see the city. They ring through the dry air, measured and solemn, as if warning rather than celebrating. Inside the Grand Council chamber, President Paul Kruger sits beneath a massive oil portrait of himself. Same beard, same heavy brow, listening to reports about the growing swarm of foreigners in the mines. His ministers argue in whispers that sound like gunfire in slow motion. You're standing at the edge of the room, a fly on the wall, as the Republic of the Boers debates how to survive being outnumbered in its own land. Kruger's voice, when it finally breaks the tension, is soft and gravelly. "The Lord placed us here," he says, "not to sell the birthright of our fathers for foreign gold." He's no demagogue. He speaks like a preacher who's already seen the end written in scripture. Outside, ox wagons creak along the dusty streets. Children play barefoot, their laughter swallowed by the clang of a distant mine shaft. The Boers feel history closing in. You step into the street. Pretoria is less a city than a stubborn village pretending to be one. The sandstone buildings glow in the sun, but you can tell the wealth hasn't stayed here. It's down south, under the ground in Johannesburg, fueling a world Kruger can't control. British newspapers mock him as an old man out of time. Paul, a rustic patriarch clinging to the past. Yet to the Boers, he's the living symbol of resistance, a man who refuses to bend the knee to London or to the golden idols of industry. And here lies the paradox. Kruger's defiance becomes both shield and trap. By refusing to grant political rights to the Uitlanders, he preserves Boer control but guarantees British outrage. The Outlanders, mostly English-speaking and wealthy, now form their own associations, issue petitions, and flood London with complaints about taxation without representation. Sound familiar? Even the irony doesn't stop the propaganda machine. You read one of the pamphlets, "The Boer Republic, a tyranny in the heart of civilization." The headline feels almost theatrical, but it works. British politicians latch onto it. Suddenly, it isn't about gold or control. It's about liberty, democracy, the rights of the Englishman abroad. The same empire that rules India and Ireland without consent is now lecturing on fairness. Historians still argue whether Kruger ever truly grasped how dangerous this moral framing was. Some suggest he believed Britain wouldn't risk another war after the humiliation of Majuba Hill. Others say he thought the Almighty would intervene again, as in the last war. Either way, he underestimated both British pride and British newspapers. Meanwhile, on the mines, the Uitlanders grow restless. They call Kruger's government corrupt, inefficient, and archaic. They resent being taxed for roads that lead only to Boer farms and railways that favor Boer trade routes. But their biggest grievance is personal, the right to vote. For them, it's about equality. For Kruger, it's about survival. If the Outlanders get the vote, the Boers, already a minority, lose their country by ballot before ever losing it by bullet. You spend an evening in a Johannesburg tavern again. The miners' talk is angrier now, their laughter shorter. One man slams his fist on the table. "We're British, and we're ruled by peasants." Another mutters, "Wait till London hears about this." A pianist in the corner plays an off-key waltz, and for a moment, you forget you're in a tinderbox. Across the border, imperial interests sharpen their knives. Cecil Rhodes, forced to resign after the Jameson raid, still wields influence like a ghost behind the curtains. The Cape Press stokes fury with headlines about Boer arrogance. And in London, a new generation of politicians sees the Transvaal as both a threat and an opportunity. If Britain can unite all of South Africa under one flag, it'll be an empire within the empire, a southern fortress of trade, coal, and gold. So the pressure builds, invisible but immense. Telegrams buzz, envoys travel, offers of compromise are made, rejected, and remade until they're indistinguishable from insults. Every delay feels like a countdown. Kruger himself senses it. He begins speaking of fate more than politics. We shall not be driven into war, he insists. But if war comes, we shall meet it as men who trust in God. He starts appearing in public less often, retreating to his farm near Rustenburg, where he prays under the same fig tree his father once planted. You can picture him there at dusk, the wind stirring his hat brim, as if even the air itself is restless. Then, in the winter of 1899, diplomatic hopes are revived, or so it seems. British High Commissioner Sir Alfred Milner and Kruger's representative President Steyn of the Orange Free State meet in Bloemfontein. The world watches. Perhaps, just perhaps, they can avoid catastrophe. You can smell the tension in that conference room. The curtains are drawn against the dusty wind, and the two men sit across a polished table like mirror opposites. Milner, tall, cold, and precise. Kruger's envoy, round-faced, deliberate, and quietly furious. Milner insists that the Uitlanders must be given full voting rights. The Boers offer partial concessions, a 5-year residency requirement instead of 14. Milner shakes his head. We must have equality for all white men, he says, emphasizing white, as if that makes the demand progressive. The room goes quiet. Everyone knows what he really means. British men. A quirky tidbit. One translator later claimed that the meeting broke down not over policy, but over posture. Milner kept sitting rigidly upright while the Boer delegates slouched comfortably. He looked like a telegraph pole among willows, the interpreter joked. You can almost see it, but the humor fades quickly. After weeks of deadlock, the conference collapses. Each side blames the other. Newspapers in London accuse Kruger of obstinacy. Newspapers in Pretoria call Milner a snake in a waistcoat. Somewhere between those headlines, peace dies without ceremony. Historians still argue who bears the greater fault. Was Milner under orders from London to provoke war? Was Kruger blinded by faith and pride? The record leaves enough ambiguity to keep professors employed for centuries. What's clear is that by mid-1899, diplomacy has become theater, and everyone in the audience can smell gunpowder behind the curtains. You ride out of Bloemfontein at dusk, the last sunlight turning the veld copper red. A Boer farmer passes you on horseback, rifle slung casually across his shoulder. There's talk of war, he says. But there's always talk of war. His voice is calm, but his eyes are tired. You both know that this time, the talk feels different. In London, newspapers call for firmness. In Pretoria, preachers call for courage. The empire begins shipping troops across the sea, and the Boers begin praying in earnest. Kruger, now 74, looks out from the balcony of his official residence one night, the air heavy with dust and expectation. If it is the Lord's will, he murmurs, we shall go down fighting. The lamp beside him flickers, and for an instant, his shadow looms enormous across the wall, like an old prophet about to watch his world burn. Soon, his government will send the ultimatum that turns words into bullets. But for this moment, Pretoria is still quiet, the stars cruelly serene. You look up at them and wonder how many wars they've watched begin this same way, with pride, fear, and men convinced they're right. The bells of the city toll again, echoing off the iron roofs, fading into the endless veld, and the wind carries the sound toward the British camps gathering beyond the border. It's not warning anymore, it's invitation. The night before war feels wrong in your bones. The air is too still, the crickets too quiet, and even the horses seem to know what's coming. You're in Pretoria again, October 1899. Watching President Paul Kruger pace beneath the gaslight of his study, a parchment trembling in his hand. On that single sheet of paper rests the future of two republics and the spark that will ignite a continent. It's an ultimatum, written in stern Dutch phrases that leave no room for misunderstanding. It demands that Britain withdraw all its troops from the borders of the Transvaal and Orange Free State within 48 hours, halt further reinforcements, and submit to arbitration. If not, the Boers will consider it an act of war. Kruger lays down the paper, sighs, and rubs his eyes. He's 74, his joints ache, but his will is iron. "Let them call me stubborn," he mutters, "but we shall not be slaves." His ministers nod, grim and silent. Across the table sits Stephanus Stein, president of the Orange Free State, whose face betrays the fear Kruger refuses to show. Together, they seal the document. Outside, a courier waits on horseback beneath the full moon, ready to carry it toward the British lines at Cape Town. When the telegram reaches Sir Alfred Milner, he doesn't even bother to reply. Britain's answer is already marching. The next dawn, Boer commandos gather along the borders like dust devils forming in the veld. Farmers leave their plows. Young boys saddle up with rifles taller than themselves, and church bells toll not for prayer, but for mobilization. They wear broad-brimmed hats, bandoliers across their chests, and expressions of quiet resolve. There are no uniforms, just civilians transformed overnight into an army of believers. You ride with them for a while, the scent of leather and gun oil thick in the air. The men hum hymns instead of war songs. "The Lord is our fortress," one whispers. Another adjusts the family Bible in his saddlebag next to cartridges. It's an image that will haunt the British generals who believe they're marching against peasants, only to find they're facing zealots with rifles and perfect aim. Meanwhile, across the border in Natal and the Cape Colony, British troops polish their buttons and joke nervously. They're regulars, disciplined, professional, and certain of an easy victory. To them, the Boers are backwater farmers led by prophets. The Empire, after all, has just crushed the Mahdi in Sudan and subdued tribes across Asia. What could a few thousand Dutchmen possibly do? You might want to whisper to them, plenty. The Boers strike first. On October 11th, 1899, their horsemen cross into British territory, fanning out toward Mafeking, Kimberley, and Ladysmith, names that will soon echo through dispatches and headlines. The lightning speed of their advance stuns everyone. Columns of dust rise across the plains as they move in loose formation. No marching bands, no drums, just the creak of saddles and the clicking of Mauser bolts. At Mafeking, a small frontier town defended by the eccentric Colonel Baden-Powell, the Boers surround the garrison and begin shelling it with old but reliable field guns nicknamed Long Toms. In Kimberley, they cut telegraph wires and rail lines, trapping the diamond town's British residents inside. Farther east, in Natal, General Piet Joubert leads his riders toward Ladysmith, where thousands of British troops are about to learn the art of waiting. Inside those towns, panic and patriotism mingle in equal measure. Women and children dig shelters and gardens. Civilians volunteer to carry messages under fire. And in London, newspapers declare that the Empire is under siege. It's not technically true. The Empire spans half the planet, but perception is everything. A quirky tidbit. During the siege of Mafeking, Baden-Powell organized teenage boys into a messenger corps, an idea so successful it later inspired the founding of the Boy Scouts. So yes, the global scouting movement technically owes its existence to a desperate colonial siege. History has a wicked sense of irony. The British public greets the war with excitement bordering on delusion. Patriotic songs fill the music halls. Toy soldiers in khaki appear in shop windows. It'll be over by Christmas, they say, because it always is. Until it isn't. Within weeks, the reality filters back. The Boers are not breaking. They're winning. You follow one Boer commando as it moves through the Drakensberg foothills. The men dismount, take up positions among rocks, and vanish into the landscape like ghosts. A British patrol appears below, bright, orderly, and fatally visible. The first shots echo, and within minutes the British are pinned, unable to locate where death is coming from. The Boers use smokeless powder. Their bullets seem to come from the wind itself. One British officer writes home, "They shoot as if born to the rifle." He's not exaggerating. Every Boer boy grows up hunting jackals and springbok. Their marksmanship is almost supernatural. They don't fight in lines, they fight in whispers and flashes. Historians still argue whether this early Boer success was strategy or simply home field advantage. Some claim their decentralized command gave them agility. Others point out that British arrogance did most of the Boers' work for them. Either way, the result is the same. British columns stumble into ambush after ambush, their supply wagons burning behind them. In Pretoria, Kruger receives reports with quiet satisfaction. His aides cheer each victory, but he warns them not to boast. "The English are slow to anger," he says, "but once roused, they are terrible." Still, hope blooms across the republics. Church bells ring in triumph. School children sing hymns of deliverance. For a fleeting moment, it feels as though David might actually beat Goliath. Back in London, the headlines are less joyful. "British checked in Natal," one reads. "Lord Salisbury demands answers." Reinforcements are ordered immediately. Entire divisions recalled from India, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. By December, ships are unloading tens of thousands of fresh troops in South African ports. The Empire is awake now, and it's angry. But anger doesn't equal competence. The commanders on the ground, Generals Buller, Methuen, and Gadakri, will soon turn optimism into disaster. We're heading toward the nightmare soldiers will later call Black Week. For now, you linger in those first months, when the Boers still believe the war might end quickly. Around campfires, they roast biltong and swap jokes about English gentlemen who can't ride a horse without a valet. Their morale is high, their faith higher. They've captured thousands of prisoners, seized rifles and cannons, and driven the British back in confusion. One night, a young commando sings an old Dutch psalm beneath the stars, his voice cracking on the high notes. You realize that half these men have never been farther than their nearest market town. Yet here they are, defying the largest empire on Earth. It's both foolish and magnificent. Historians still debate whether Kruger had a long-term strategy beyond divine hope. His generals urged him to march deeper into British territory, to push hard before reinforcements arrived. But Kruger hesitated. "We are not conquerors," he insisted. "We only defend what is ours." That decision, noble or naive depending on your viewpoint, would shape the rest of the war. By late November 1899, the sieges tighten. Food runs low in Kimberley. Mafeking's residents joke grimly about eating their horses. In Ladysmith, British soldiers dig trenches under constant shell fire, their rations reduced to mealy porridge. Disease does what bullets cannot. In one diary, a nurse writes, "We sleep to the music of the guns and wake to the silence of the dead." You read that line and realize that for both sides, this war is no longer about rights or independence. It's about endurance. Still, in the hills above Ladysmith, Boer scouts watch the British tents flicker like stars across the plain and feel a strange pride. They've done the impossible. They've put the empire on its knees, even if only for a moment. Back in Pretoria, Kruger kneels for evening prayer. His wife, Gesina, rests her hand on his shoulder. Outside, rain begins to fall softly on the veranda roof. The smell of wet earth fills the air, a reminder that this land, this stubborn patch of Africa, is what the whole struggle is about: ownership, belonging, pride. And tonight at least, it still belongs to them. But far to the south, the ships keep coming, gray silhouettes against gray seas, each carrying more soldiers, more guns, more of that relentless imperial will. You can almost hear the ocean whispering, "Your move, Paul. Your move." The rain stops, and with it the illusion that the war will be short. By December 1899, The British Empire has poured nearly 50,000 fresh troops into South Africa. Their camps stretch across the Cape like a mirage of canvas and khaki. You can smell the damp wool, hear the groan of wagons, the whinny of horses that don't understand why they're here. Yet even with all this power assembled, the empire seems lost, because leadership, like a compass, is spinning wildly. General Sir Redvers Buller, Commander-in-Chief, has a face carved from granite and a reputation for caution that borders on paralysis. He's brave, yes, but not quick. His orders arrive too late, his scouts too few, and his maps too wrong. Across the frontier, Boer commandos wait like lions in long grass, invisible until the kill. You can feel the tension in the air, like static before a thunderstorm. 3 British columns are on the move, 3 separate offensives meant to smash the Boer sieges in one decisive week. What happens next will be remembered as Black Week, when the British Empire met the kind of humiliation it hadn't tasted since the American Revolution. The first blow lands at Stormberg on December 10th. General Gadacre leads 3,000 men through the darkness to surprise a Boer position. They march all night, stumbling over rocks and thorn bushes, guided by faulty maps that might as well have been drawn by a drunkard. By dawn, they've lost their way entirely. The Boers, perched on the high ground, open fire as the mist lifts. Chaos erupts. Men run into each other's lines, officers shout contradictory orders, ammunition boxes tumble into ravines. From where you stand, it looks like a play gone wrong. Red flashes in the gray dawn, the chorus of rifle fire rising to a desperate crescendo. Within hours, Gadacre's force is broken. Hundreds are captured. Others flee into the hills. One soldier later writes, "We never saw the enemy, only the light from their muzzles." You'd think the empire might learn from such a blunder. It doesn't. 4 days later, on December 11th, General Methuen tries to relieve Kimberley and runs into the Boer trenches at Magersfontein. Yes, that same waterlogged nightmare where we began our story. The Highland Brigade charges again through rain-soaked mud, bagpipes skirling, kilts heavy as lead. And again, they are cut down by invisible marksmen hidden at the base of the hill. The dead pile up in silence. Officers die standing, swords in hand, as if still believing courage can deflect bullets. One Boer fighter later recalled, "They came at us like ghosts in the rain. Brave men, foolish men." You'd like to believe bravery counted for something here, but it doesn't. It's slaughter, pure and simple. By evening, Methuen's army retreats, leaving behind nearly 1,000 casualties. In London, the headlines scream, "Another failure in the Cape." You can almost hear the clink of teacups pausing in outrage. Then comes Colenso, December 15th, the final act of this tragic farce. Buller himself leads 20,000 men to cross the Tugela River and relieve Ladysmith. He has artillery, cavalry, engineers, everything a textbook general could ask for, except, apparently, luck and common sense. At dawn, the British advance in perfect order, only to discover they're walking into an L-shaped ambush. Boer marksmen concealed among the scrub unleash a storm of Mauser fire. The air becomes a swarm of invisible hornets. Shells burst over the riverbank, horses rear, and men drop into the mud. A British gun battery, isolated near the river, tries to unlimber and return fire, but their crews are torn apart before they can load. You can hear the cries of the wounded, the shouted commands lost in smoke. One officer, young, terrified, determined, leads a handful of men back to save the guns. His name is Frederick Roberts, son of the famous Field Marshal Lord Roberts. He reaches the river, tries to haul a gun by hand, and is shot dead before making it 10 yards. His father will learn of his death just days before taking command of the entire war. Historians still argue whether Buller could have salvaged Colenso. Some say he panicked too soon. Others claim no plan could have worked against such perfect Boer defenses. Either way, by noon he orders retreat. Thousands of British soldiers stumble back across the Tugela, exhausted, humiliated, leaving guns and wounded behind. It is the blackest week the Empire has ever endured. Back in Pretoria, the Boers celebrate with modesty. There's no looting, no parades, just quiet satisfaction. They've beaten the British 3 times in 7 days. Farmers who once drove cattle now write their names into military history. Around campfires, they joke that God must have traded sides. A quirky tidbit: Boer scouts nickname their German-made field guns Long Toms, after the deep bass boom that rolled across the plains. When the British heard that sound, they knew trouble was coming. Some soldiers swore they could tell which gun fired by the pitch of its echo. "That's old Tom from the North Ridge," they'd say. "He's got our number again." But victory, like the African sun, is fleeting. While Kruger's men rejoice, the British are regrouping. Across the sea, newspapers cry out for vengeance. Recruiting offices overflow. The Empire's pride has been pricked, and there's nothing more dangerous than a wounded giant. In London, Queen Victoria herself demands updates daily. Prime Minister Salisbury and Secretary of State for War Lansdowne decide the situation requires total overhaul. They summon a man revered as a hero of empire, Field Marshal Frederick Roberts, the same whose son lies buried beside the Tugela. Alongside him comes a younger, sterner deputy, Herbert Kitchener, the face of cold determination from the Nile campaigns. You can feel the shift in the wind. The amateurs have had their turn. Now the professionals are coming. When Roberts lands at Cape Town in January 1900, he brings not only fresh troops, but a new doctrine. Gone are the reckless charges and bright red targets. His soldiers wear khaki now, a color born of mud and compromise. He reorganizes the army into mobile columns, emphasizing mounted infantry, supply discipline, and reconnaissance. "We will outthink them before we outshoot them," he tells his staff. Kitchener, ever the engineer, begins drawing plans for a logistical web, railways, depots, water points that will strangle the republics inch by inch. It's not glamorous, but it's effective. You realize the war is about to change from chaos to machinery. Historians still debate whether Roberts' arrival saved the war or merely prolonged it. Some see him as a master strategist. Others argue he simply applied industrial muscle to crush a smaller foe. But there's no denying his impact. The British Army, humiliated in December, will soon begin to move with purpose. And yet, before Roberts can make his mark, the soldiers in the field must endure a few more weeks of misery. The sieges drag on. Ladysmith is starving, Kimberley gasping for water, Mafeking surviving on ingenuity and prayer. British newspapers print endless columns of casualty lists. The word siege becomes fashionable in poetry, less so in life. In Ladysmith, one officer writes, "The rain is constant, the dysentery worse. We eat horseflesh and pretend it's beef. Some men name their lice for amusement. It's the sort of humor that only soldiers understand, the kind that keeps madness at bay." And yet, amid all this darkness, small miracles persist. When relief finally comes, weeks later, it will arrive like the first breath after drowning. But for now, December closes in gloom, and the Empire mourns its pride along with its dead. You stand at the edge of the Tugela, looking at the silent guns abandoned in the mud. The sky above you is a dull pewter gray, reflecting the mood of every man still alive to see it. Somewhere out there, Roberts' ship is cutting through waves toward Cape Town, bringing with it both salvation and escalation. The Boers, still watching from their ridges, can't yet know that their hardest battles are still ahead. For now, they reload, rebuild their campfires, and whisper prayers of gratitude. But the wind carries another sound now, low, steady, metallic. The sound of an empire rearming its will. You wake to the sound of bugles, not birds. The British camps stretch from horizon to horizon, rows of khaki tents glowing pale in the dawn. It's early 1900, and the empire has reassembled itself into something unrecognizable, disciplined, relentless, and humming with purpose. The new commander, Field Marshal Frederick Roberts, inspects his troops with the calm authority of a man who's already imagined victory. The soldiers whisper that he's here for revenge, not just for the empire's pride, but for his son, who fell at Colenso. His deputy, Lord Kitchener, stalks behind him, expression carved from steel, eyes like cold fire. Between them, they radiate inevitability. You sense that whatever spirit lifted the Boers through their early triumphs has just met its opposite, the Empire's machine heart. The first priority is clear: relieve the besieged towns, Kimberley, Ladysmith, Mafeking, each a glowing ember of resistance and morale. Roberts wastes no time. He reorganizes the army into mobile divisions, mounts infantry, trims baggage, and demands precision. "We must move as swiftly as they," he says, but with twice their endurance. Under his command rides Lieutenant General John French, a cavalryman with the instincts of a hawk. French's task: break through to Kimberley and lift the siege. For weeks, the Diamond Town has suffered shells, hunger, and disease. Its residents joke grimly about eating horse meat seasoned with gunpowder. Children play games pretending to dodge Long Tom shells. They cheer every day they're still alive. You ride with French's column as it pushes through the dusty plains of the Northern Cape. The sun scorches everything in sight, bleaching bones and dreams alike. Yet the cavalry moves fast, too fast for the Boers to react. One evening, scouts spot the towers of Kimberley shimmering in the heat haze. By the next day, French's men gallop into town, sabers flashing, greeted by delirious crowds waving Union Jacks made from bedsheets. The siege is broken. A quirky tidbit: one Kimberley resident described the moment as the sound of hooves becoming freedom. The first horse that entered town was reportedly fed bread soaked in champagne. But Roberts's real blow falls not at Kimberley. It falls on General Piet Cronje and the main Boer army retreating eastward. Cronje's men, encumbered with wagons, women, and children, make for the Modder River. Roberts sends cavalry racing ahead to cut them off. The trap snaps shut at Paardeberg. For 10 days, the Boers hold out in a bend of the river, entrenched but surrounded. British artillery rains fire day and night. The smell of gunpowder and rot mixes with the stench of horse carcasses. You can hear the thunder of the guns 20 miles away, echoing through the veld like the heartbeat of a dying world. Inside the Boer lager, discipline frays. Ammunition runs low. Food turns to ash. Cronje, proud and stubborn, refuses to surrender. "We fight to the last," he insists, even as his men beg him to break out under cover of darkness. Historians still argue whether he was brave or blind, heroic in defiance or reckless in pride. On February 27th, the anniversary of the Boers' great victory at Majuba Hill, fate turns cruel. Cronje capitulates, leading his exhausted followers out with hands raised. The symbolism isn't lost on anyone. The very date that once marked Boer triumph now seals their first great defeat. Over 4,000 prisoners are taken. The British cheer. Kruger weeps. You walk among the prisoners. Gaunt men with cracked lips, their faces baked by sun and soot. Some sing psalms softly, others stare at nothing. One young commando mutters, "We'll fight again, just not today." You believe him. Meanwhile, Roberts's army advances like a tide. Bloemfontein, the capital of the Orange Free State, falls in March. The Union Jack flutters over its courthouse, and for the first time in the war, Britain claims to hold the moral high ground again. Soldiers parade through the streets. Local children stare in awe and resentment. Roberts issues proclamations promising fair treatment and eventual self-rule. It sounds generous, but everyone knows what it really means. The republics are finished, at least on paper. A quirky aside, in Bloemfontein, British soldiers reportedly held a cricket match in the main square within a week of capture. Empire restored, one officer wrote in his journal, with wickets intact. Yet victory, as ever, carries shadows. Typhoid breaks out among the troops. Water is scarce. Roberts himself nearly collapses from exhaustion. The war, which the newspapers now call nearly won, is far from over. The Boers, stubborn as drought, refuse to accept defeat. While Roberts marches north toward Pretoria, Boer commandos regroup in the veld. They shed their wagons, travel light, strike hard. Small units under men like Koos de la Rey and Christian de Wet begin harassing supply lines, derailing trains, cutting telegraphs. It's war turned personal now, a duel between mobility and machinery. But before that transformation takes full hold, the old-style war plays out one last time. In May 1900, Roberts enters the Transvaal. The British columns stretch for miles. Infantry, artillery, ox wagons creaking under ammunition. Cavalry scouting ahead. Dust clouds rise like banners. Villages empty before them. Boers melt into the hills. By early June, Roberts reaches Pretoria. The capital, once the proud heart of the Boer Republic, stands quiet, its streets swept clean as if awaiting judgment. Kruger has already fled eastward, clutching his Bible and papers. When British troops march through the gates, they find the city almost ceremonial in its surrender. No banners, no fanfare, just the ghost of an idea dying quietly in the African sun. Roberts rides at the head of his column, hat raised. The townspeople watch from behind lace curtains. Somewhere in the crowd, a child asks, "Is the war over now?" His mother doesn't answer. It should have ended there. Every normal war would have. Capitals captured, armies scattered, leaders in flight. What else is left? Roberts telegraphs London. Pretoria taken. Resistance collapsing. Parliament erupts in cheers. Church bells ring across Britain. Queen Victoria sends her congratulations. The newspapers announce peace. They are wrong. Historians still argue why the Boers didn't surrender then. Some say it was faith, others pride, others the sheer impossibility of giving up one's homeland. Whatever the reason, they vanish into the veld like ghosts, reforming into smaller, deadlier groups. The next phase will not be war as the British understand it. It will be something leaner, faster, and far crueler. For now, though, Roberts savors his triumph. He establishes headquarters in Pretoria, issues amnesties for surrendering Boers, and begins the long process of pacification. Kitchener, less sentimental, studies maps and calculates supply routes. "We'll need more blockhouses," he mutters, "and tighter lines of wire." You step outside into the Pretoria evening. The air smells of dust and eucalyptus. Soldiers light cigarettes. Officers toast victory. Yet in the distance, gunfire still cracks faintly. Somewhere out there, a Boer commando is reminding the Empire that taking cities is not the same as taking a country. And as the stars blink above, cold and clear, you sense that the war's second birth has already begun. Quieter, sharper, infinite in its patience. The kind of war that doesn't end with a treaty, but with exhaustion. For now, the Empire sleeps on its laurels, unaware that the dream of victory will soon curdle into nightmare once again. You smell the smoke before you see the flames. It's late 1900, and the British columns that once marched triumphantly into Pretoria now move through a countryside on fire, literally and politically. The war that was supposed to end with flags and fanfare has dissolved into something harder to see, harder to stop. The Boers have disappeared into the veld. No more grand armies or formal lines of battle, just small bands of mounted men, 30 or 40 at most, striking at night, vanishing by dawn. They attack supply convoys, derail trains, ambush patrols, and fade into the scrub before the British can form up. The Empire's soldiers call them phantoms on ponies. You ride with one such commando under Christian de Wet, a wiry, fox-faced leader whose genius lies in never fighting the same way twice. His men carry everything they need: rifles, ammunition, and biltong, dried meat. They sleep under the stars, ride by instinct, and move so fast that even rumors can't keep up. De Wet once escaped encirclement by 6,000 British troops, crossing a flooded river at night while his horses swam through lightning and gunfire. "The veld is my fortress," he boasted. And it wasn't arrogance, it was geography. Historians still argue whether De Wet invented guerrilla warfare or merely perfected it. What's certain is that he turned the Boers' weakness into strength. The same mobility that once helped them hunt now keeps them alive. In response, Lord Roberts tries reason. He issues proclamations promising leniency to any Boer who surrenders. Many do, exhausted farmers who've lost sons or herds. But for every one who lays down his rifle, another takes it up. The war has become personal now. Farms burned, families displaced, neighbors killed. It's vengeance, not politics, that fuels the commandos. By November, Roberts realizes diplomacy won't win this. He sails home to England, leaving command to Lord Kitchener. The man who once built railways across the desert now sets out to build something darker, a system to choke the life out of a nation. Kitchener studies the map of South Africa like a chessboard. Every rail line becomes a vein to be severed. Every valley, a trap to be sprung. His plan is brutally simple: divide, isolate, and starve the enemy. British troops will sweep the countryside, burning any farm suspected of aiding the commandos. Civilians, women, children, even the elderly, will be removed to prevent them from supplying the fighters. The Scorched Earth campaign has begun. You ride behind one of these columns as it moves across the Free State. Smoke rises from farmhouses in every direction. Soldiers throw kerosene onto thatched roofs, laughing nervously to mask their unease. Chickens scatter, horses scream. In the distance, a Boer mother stands on her porch, watching her life burn, her face carved from stone. "Tell your queen," she says to no one in particular, "that the land remembers." A quirky tidbit: British troops nicknamed the operation the Drive, as if it were a fox hunt. Some even kept score. Farms burned, livestock seized, prisoners taken. It was efficient, it was organized, and it was horrific. Meanwhile, the Boers adapt again. They split into even smaller units, carrying no supplies at all, living off whatever they can capture. They strike at night, often dressed in scavenged khaki to blend in. They hit rail depots, torch telegraph lines, and vanish into the hills before dawn. The British, in turn, construct blockhouses, tiny stone forts spaced every 1,000 yards, linked by barbed wire. It's the world's first modern counterinsurgency network. Soon, South Africa is crisscrossed with more than 8,000 miles of wire and 50,000 blockhouses. Soldiers sit inside, sweating through endless days, peering into the night for movement. The veld begins to look less like wilderness and more like a prison without walls. Historians still debate whether Kitchener's system was strategic brilliance or moral catastrophe. It worked militarily, slowly, but at a price no one foresaw. The captured civilians, tens of thousands of Boer women and children, are herded into what the British call concentration camps. The term sounds bureaucratic, but the reality is brutal. The camps are overcrowded, unsanitary, starved of food and medicine. Disease spreads like wildfire: measles, typhoid, dysentery. You visit one near Bloemfontein. The smell hits first: smoke, waste, sickness. Rows of canvas tents sag under the sun. Children with hollow eyes stare from behind wire fences. A British nurse, her face pale and tight with exhaustion, whispers, "We lose 30 a day, sometimes more." She shows you a ledger of names crossed out, page after page. A mother clutches her baby, whispering an old Dutch lullaby. The child doesn't move. The song continues anyway. A few reporters manage to slip in. One of them, Emily Hobhouse, will later publish her findings in London, exposing the horror to the world. "They are dying like flies," she writes. "This is not war, it is extermination." Her report shocks Parliament and divides Britain itself. A quirky fact? Hobhouse was initially dismissed as hysterical by male officials, yet her testimony eventually forces an inquiry, the first of its kind in modern warfare. Some credit her with helping invent the concept of humanitarian accountability. But in the Veld, where the commandos still ride, mercy remains theoretical. Jan Smuts, once a law student and philosopher, becomes one of the Boer's most daring guerrilla leaders. He leads raids deep into British territory, sometimes hundreds of miles behind the lines. His men wear captured uniforms, carry stolen rifles, and live like ghosts. In one night raid, Smuts' force captures a British officer's breakfast wagon, eats everything inside, and leaves a polite thank you note signed, "The Transvaal Hotel Staff." Even in desperation, the Boers find room for mischief. Historians still argue whether these guerrillas fought out of hope or habit. By now, they know they can't win, not conventionally, but they fight anyway. Because to stop would mean admitting that everything burned was for nothing. Back in Pretoria, Kitchener watches the reports pile up: ambushes, sabotage, disease, dead livestock. He rarely shows emotion, but his diary reveals exhaustion. "I am weary of ghosts," he writes once, "and of wire that stretches farther than pity." He begins offering amnesty to commandos who surrender, promising food and safe passage. Thousands come in, thousands more refuse. The British build new camps, some for Boers, others for Black Africans displaced by the scorched earth drives. Their suffering, though less reported, is immense. Over 20,000 Black civilians die in segregated camps from hunger and disease, one of the forgotten tragedies of this war. By 1901, the British hold every city, every railway, every farm worth farming. And yet, they still don't control the night. You can imagine it. A lone Boer rider galloping across the moonlit plain, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his horse's hooves muffled by sand. Behind him, a farm burns. Ahead, nothing but horizon. He hums an old psalm under his breath. "The Lord is my shepherd," he says, though there's no flock left to guard. He doesn't fight for victory anymore. He fights because stopping means facing what's been lost. By the end of the year, the war feels less like history and more like a fever that refuses to break. The Empire has won every battle, but not the peace. And somewhere in the ashes of a ruined farmhouse, a child carves her name into a brick, proof that even when everything else is gone, memory survives. The land remembers, as that woman promised. It always does. The Veld turns cold as another winter creeps across the Transvaal. It's 1901, and the war that began with flags and speeches now lives mostly in whispers, ambushes, burnt farms, the rattle of distant gunfire swallowed by wind. The British call it mopping up. The Boers call it survival. You ride with a patrol of mounted infantry under gray skies. The soldiers are gaunt, hollow-eyed. They've been in South Africa so long the dust seems tattooed into their skin. Ahead, a farmhouse smolders, the smell of scorched thatch mixing with damp earth. "Orders," the sergeant says when you look at him. Just that, no explanation needed. Back in London, they speak of progress. Out here, progress looks like ashes. Every week, British columns sweep the countryside. Tight, mechanical, precise. They drive herds of refugees toward the camps and torch anything left standing. Villages vanish overnight. Rivers run thick with silt and ash. The Boers respond with desperation. Sudden raids, sabotaged rails, midnight attacks that vanish before dawn. One night, you watch a train derail. Rails loosened, dynamite planted under the locomotive. The explosion rips through the stillness like God's own thunder. Within minutes, Boer horsemen appear, loot what they can, and disappear into the darkness, leaving behind twisted metal and stunned survivors. It's war stripped of honor. running entirely on instinct and retribution. A quirky tidbit: British engineers start running armored trains to counter these raids, steam engines wrapped in iron plates, bristling with guns. They look like something out of a fever dream, hissing and clanking through the wilderness like mechanical beasts. But even these iron monsters can't stop the sabotage. One by one, they're wrecked or abandoned, monuments to imperial stubbornness. Historians still debate whether the British understood what kind of war they were fighting anymore. On paper, they're winning. Cities occupied, enemies scattered. But on the Veld, every hill and river still belongs to the Boers by night. Among the British ranks, fatigue turns to cruelty. Some officers boast of pacifying districts that were simply emptied. Others drink to forget. One private writes home, "We burn farms by the dozen. The flames are bright enough to see each other's guilt." Meanwhile, in the camps, the toll mounts. The women and children, those who once waited for husbands to return, now wait only for dawn. Disease kills faster than bullets. British doctors record the deaths mechanically. Exposure, dysentery, measles. They stopped writing adjectives long ago. The outcry back home grows. Emily Hobhouse's report hits Parliament like a shell burst. She describes tents without flooring, children lying on bare ground, water drawn from ditches shared with animals. Her words shame a nation that once claimed to civilize the world. The children's faces, she writes, are so thin you could blow them away like leaves. You can imagine the reaction. Some applaud her courage, others call her unpatriotic. Kitchener, when asked, replies tersely, regrettable but necessary. History will judge him for those 4 words. The Boers themselves are breaking, though they won't admit it. Supplies are gone. Ammunition runs out. They melt horses for grease, eat locusts, sleep in burrows to escape the cold. Letters from home rarely arrive. Those who surrender are branded hensoppers, handsuppers, and despised by their comrades. Others, called bitterenders, swear to fight until death or nothing. You sit with one such commando at night, the fire burning low. He's young, maybe 20, face hidden under soot. "They've taken my farm," he says quietly, "and my mother's in one of their camps. But as long as I breathe, I ride." He pulls from his pocket a tiny Bible, pages yellowed by dust. On the inside cover is a lock of hair, tied with a thread. He closes it and looks toward the horizon. "The British can have the land," he says, "but they'll never have the wind." Historians still argue what kept them going. Faith, stubbornness, or something deeper. The refusal to be forgotten. By spring, the British strategy evolves into precision strangulation. Kitchener's network of blockhouses expands until it grids the map like a net of steel. Mounted patrols ride between them nightly, firing flares into the dark. Still, the raids continue. De Wet strikes in the Free State. Smuts crosses into the Cape, raiding within sight of British forts. They move like ghosts, unseen, uncatchable, but fading. One British officer calls the war a fight against phantoms. Another writes, "We are learning to defeat silence. Even the Empire's triumphs taste hollow now." Kruger, old and ill, flees by train to Mozambique and then by ship to Europe, seeking aid that never comes. No nation dares confront Britain openly. He ends his days in exile in Switzerland, surrounded by maps of a homeland he'll never see again. A quirky fact: when Kruger died in 1904, his last words were reportedly, "It is all with God." Whether resignation or defiance, no one can tell. By 1902, the land itself seems exhausted. Grass won't grow where the fires passed. Cemeteries multiply along the railways. Even the soldiers stop cheering when new dispatches announce success. They know success just means another empty valley, another silence carved into the soil. And yet, even as morale falters, there's a strange intimacy between enemies. British patrols sometimes exchange tobacco with captured Boers. A few commandos surrender and then join the British scouts, guiding them across terrain they know better than their own faces. War erases lines until all that's left are survivors. In March, Kitchener meets secretly with Boer leaders at Middelburg, hoping to end the stalemate. They discuss peace terms by lamplight in a farmhouse surrounded by barbed wire. Kitchener offers amnesty, money for rebuilding, and vague promises of future self-rule. The Boers listen politely, then ride back into the dark. "We will speak again," one says. And they do, but not yet. Historians still debate why Kitchener offered negotiations so early. Some say he was weary, others that he feared the moral collapse of his army. Maybe he simply knew that no empire, however vast, can keep burning the same country forever. You stand one evening on a hill overlooking the endless veld. The setting sun turns the horizon into molten gold, a cruel reminder of what started all this. You remember that first glint at the Witwatersrand, the promise of fortune that drew men here like moths to a lantern. Gold began this war, but by now it's worth less than peace. Below you, a British patrol passes, horses clinking, bayonets glinting faintly. Behind them, smoke rises from another burned farm. Somewhere in that haze, a family once lived, prayed, and laughed. Now it's all gone. Like mist at dawn, a wind stirs, dry and cold. The land breathes again, softly. For a moment, you think you hear the distant rumble of thunder, but it's only the echo of artillery far to the north. The war isn't over, but it's winding down, not with triumph, not with surrender, but with exhaustion, the kind that seeps into the bones of nations and stays there for generations. You turn your gaze toward the north, where peace, fragile, imperfect, inevitable, is inching closer on tired legs. You feel it before you see it, the slow, uneven heartbeat of an exhausted war. It's April 1902, and South Africa lies gutted beneath a pale, unloving sky. The veld that once shimmered with life now looks like parchment, brittle and burned. Every road leads past graves. Every river runs shallow, choked with the dust of collapsed homesteads. The British Empire has, at last, smothered rebellion with logistics. Kitchener's blockhouses and barbed wire grids slice the land into controllable squares. Patrols sweep each sector like clockwork, driving the last Boer commandos toward the high veld and the mountains of the northeast. The few who remain ride lean horses with ribs like washboards and faces carved by wind and hunger. They're not fighting for victory anymore, just for the right to choose how the war ends. In the Free State, Christian de Wet, that fox of the veld, still eludes capture, though barely. His men are reduced to a few dozen. They live on whatever they can scavenge: stale bread, goat's milk, the occasional slaughtered ox stolen from British supply trains. De Wet sleeps only in bursts, riding at night, hiding by day. His horses die faster than he can replace them. "We are ghosts," he writes in his diary, "and the living do not see us." Farther east, Jan Smuts wages his own shadow campaign near the Cape frontier. He raids isolated garrisons, ambushes convoys, and vanishes again. He's not fighting for land anymore. He's fighting for leverage at the peace table that everyone knows must come soon. Even in defeat, their raids sting. Kitchener's daily reports sound mechanical. Line north of Belfast cut again. 1 officer wounded. 2 mules stolen. But behind each line item are faces. Young soldiers too far from home to understand why this war refuses to end. Historians still argue whether the British underestimated the Boers' endurance or overestimated their own. Some say it's pride. Others say it's the inertia of empire, too vast to admit exhaustion. Whatever the reason, this final year of fighting feels less like conquest and more like slow drowning. Inside Pretoria, the once proud British headquarters has grown eerily quiet. Kitchener stalks through its corridors like a sleepless warden, his boots echoing on the marble floors of a borrowed capital. Maps cover the walls, lines of railways, shaded blocks of wire, red pins marking victories, black pins marking losses. The red outweigh the black, but he doesn't look satisfied. He never does. He writes letters every night, long and clipped, to London. Morale remains steady, enemy resistance fragmented, situation nearing conclusion. But his private notes tell a different story. Men tired, horses dying, weather worsening. We are winning ourselves into ruin. In the concentration camps, the situation has gone from horror to numb routine. Disease kills faster than the doctors can record. The official death toll has surpassed 40,000, mostly women and children, both Boer and Black African. The camp administrators stop counting some days. You walk through one such camp at Vereeniging, the wind whipping through the tents. No one cries anymore. Even grief is tired. A British nurse you met before, her apron now gray from overuse, kneels beside a sick child. "We ran out of quinine last week," she says. "They told us more was coming. It always is." She forces a smile that doesn't reach her eyes. Some British officers begin sending their own reports home, contradicting official optimism. One writes, "We are building our victory upon graves." Another simply notes, "These people will remember." A quirky tidbit. To raise morale, Kitchener orders the creation of recreation tents in some camps, complete with hymn books, sewing circles, and occasional lectures on sanitation. It's as absurd as it sounds. The lectures are well attended. The diseases remain unimpressed. Still, through all the horror, something shifts. The Boers begin to realize that they cannot outlast the Empire's machines. The commandos are out of ammunition, horses, and hope. Families in the camps send word to their men. "Come home if you can. We are dying without you." Louis Botha, one of the last remaining Boer generals, starts secret correspondence with Kitchener. The letters are formal, almost polite, as if written between gentlemen rather than enemies. Kitchener respects him, admiration between soldiers who understand each other's burdens. By late April, the first delegates from both sides agree to meet in the small mining town of Vereeniging, south of Johannesburg. No one calls it peace yet. They call it negotiation. But everyone knows what it means. You arrive at Vereeniging on a gray morning, the air heavy with coal smoke from nearby factories. Representatives from the Transvaal and the Orange Free State gather in a large, drafty hall, their clothes threadbare from years in the field. They look less like politicians than survivors. Across from them sit British officers in crisp uniforms, boots polished, pens ready. For 2 weeks, they argue over every line. The Boers demand amnesty for their fighters, money to rebuild their farms, and, most painfully, some promise that their language, Dutch, and its child, Afrikaans, will not be erased. The British insist on full surrender and the end of both republics' independence. You can hear the weariness in every voice. Even anger sounds tired now. Historians still debate the sincerity of Britain's promises at Vereeniging. Some see the treaty as magnanimous for a victor, others as an act of pragmatic cruelty wrapped in polite phrases. Both interpretations are true. In the end, on May 31st, 1902, the delegates sign. The Treaty of Vereeniging ends the Second Boer War. The terms are as follows. The Transvaal and Orange Free State surrender their independence and become British colonies. The British promise financial aid to rebuild farms and railways. Dutch and Afrikaans may continue to be used in schools and courts. No decisions are made on the political rights of Black Africans. Those questions are deferred to future governments, meaning white rule will continue unchallenged. It's peace by exhaustion, not reconciliation. But after nearly 3 years, 100,000 dead, and a land in ruins, it's enough. When the news reaches London, bells ring again, though this time less triumphantly. In Pretoria, Kitchener receives the Boer generals with the stiff courtesy of a man who understands he's ended something he can't quite justify. They shake hands. He says, "You fought like men." Botha replies, "And now we must live like them." That night, rain falls for the first time in weeks. It taps softly against the roof of the Vereeniging hall, mingling with the rustle of exhausted paperwork. Outside, soldiers from both sides light fires and, for the first time, share tobacco. Some even laugh. It sounds strange after so much silence. You walk through the wet grass, listening to the water soak into the ash-hardened earth. The war is over, but its echo will last far longer than any treaty can predict. A quirky postscript? When the British Army finally begins dismantling its barbed wire network, farmers start using the leftover posts to fence their rebuilt homesteads. From war, we get boundaries, one Boer says bitterly. He's right, though not just about fences. At dawn, the sky clears. Smoke from the last campfires drifts upward, pale and thin. Somewhere out there, De Wet rides home for the first time in years. Smuts returns to his farm, a future statesman in the making. And the Empire, satisfied but scarred, prepares to fold this blood-soaked chapter into its long, self-glorifying history. The war that began with a charge through waterlogged fields ends here, in signatures, silence, and rain. You take one last look at the veld, green again in the morning light, and realize something humbling. Empires write treaties. The land writes memory. The guns have stopped, but the silence feels heavier than the noise ever did. It's June 1902, a month after the Treaty of Vereeniging, and South Africa is trying to remember what peace sounds like. The British soldiers pack up their tents. The Boer commandos limp home on skeletal horses, and the vultures, which have grown fat on the war, circle out of habit. The sky itself seems cautious, gray, watchful, like it's not sure whether to trust the word peace. You walk through what used to be a battlefield near the Modder River. The trenches are half filled with water, their edges softened by rain. Rusted cartridges glint among the reeds. A soldier's dented helmet lies beside a tangle of barbed wire that now serves as a trellis for creeping weeds. Nature is reclaiming what men once claimed as strategy, but it's slow work. The ground is still sour with ash and grief. In the nearby town, a group of Boer families step off a wagon returning from a concentration camp. Their clothes hang loose, their eyes are sunken, and yet they move with a strange kind of dignity. One woman, barely 30, looks twice that age. She stops, bends down, and touches the soil, her soil, for the first time in 3 years. "We are home," she whispers, though the house she once lived in is nothing but a charred outline. The British military administration sets about the enormous task of reconstruction. On paper, it's an act of mercy. In practice, it's also an exercise in control. Teams of engineers rebuild railways and telegraph lines, not just to restore trade, but to ensure no region can ever again wage independent war. Reconstruction becomes the Empire's favorite word, clean, progressive, and conveniently forgetful. Lord Alfred Milner, once the man whose inflexibility helped spark the conflict, is now the architect of its peace. He envisions a new South Africa, united, industrial, loyal to the crown. He floods the civil service with young British administrators, idealistic men fresh from Oxford, all convinced they can rebuild a nation through paperwork. The locals call them the kindergarten. A quirky tidbit: one of those kindergarten members, Lionel Curtis, will later help design the concept of the Commonwealth itself. Imperial bureaucracy, it seems, breeds dreamers as well as clerks. But for the Boers, Reconstruction looks more like slow humiliation. Compensation funds arrive late or not at all. Farms must be rebuilt from scorched soil. Oxen and plows are scarce. The proud independence that once defined the republics has been replaced by ration cards and imperial overseers. Historians still debate whether Britain's reconstruction efforts were benevolent or calculated. Some argue Milner truly wanted a just peace. Others see it as the soft edge of empire, control dressed up as reform. Either way, the scars don't fade easily. In the towns, British soldiers mingle uneasily with Boer civilians. There are pubs where both drink in silence, eyes fixed on the same horizon, pretending not to notice each other. Sometimes fights break out. Sometimes they trade stories. It's awkward, human, and inevitable. You hear one British corporal mutter, "We came to civilize, but the land civilized us." He's not wrong. The vastness of South Africa, its heat and isolation, has stripped the polish from everyone. The soldiers who arrived in bright parade uniforms now leave sunburned, scarred, and older than their years. For the Boers, the war's end brings no real rest. Many return to find their wives or mothers buried in the camp cemeteries. Whole families have vanished. Some turn bitter, retreating into small farming communities where they teach their children never to trust the British again. Others, pragmatic or exhausted, choose to cooperate. Among them are men like Louis Botha and Jan Smuts, who will soon enter politics to shape the very nation they once fought to destroy. You find Smuts one afternoon in Pretoria, sitting on the veranda of a modest home, writing by lamplight. He's thinner now, his eyes shadowed, but his mind still burns. "We must make peace real," he says quietly, "or war will return in another form." He's already planning a future where Boers and Britons rule together, though under white supremacy that leaves the black majority voiceless. He believes it's the only way forward. Unity first, justice later. Historians still argue about Smuts' legacy. Visionary or opportunist? Peacemaker or pragmatist for the wrong cause? Both can be true. What matters now is that the seeds of modern South Africa, its unity and its divisions, are being sown in this uneasy peace. The British Army begins demobilizing, but not all its men return home. Some stay behind, marrying local women or finding work in the mines that caused the war in the first place. Johannesburg roars back to life almost immediately. Gold production resumes under new management, and the profits begin to flow again, this time straight to London's financial district. A quirky post-war fact. One of the British engineers in Johannesburg invents a new mechanical ore separator to increase gold extraction efficiency. Within 5 years, his invention doubles production and cements Britain's economic control of the region. Even peace, it seems, runs on machinery. Meanwhile, Boer children attend new schools where they're taught both English and Dutch. The Union Jack flies over the playgrounds, but the children still pray in Afrikaans. In time, their bilingualism will become a symbol of compromise, though some call it capitulation. Yet beneath this fragile reconstruction, the deeper injustice remains untouched. The Black African majority, millions of people whose land and labor fed this entire conflict, find themselves excluded from everything that follows. Their homesteads were burned alongside the Boers. Their men fought as porters and scouts for both sides. Their women suffered in their own separate camps. But when the treaty was signed, their names weren't even mentioned. One British official explained it with chilling simplicity. This was a white man's quarrel, and it must have a white man's peace. You visit a mission station near Bloemfontein, where hundreds of black refugees have gathered. They're rebuilding huts out of tin and canvas, planting meager crops in the dry soil. A preacher stands under a tree, reading from the book of Isaiah. They shall build the old wastes, they shall raise up the former desolations. His voice trembles, but his congregation murmurs, Amen. Hope, thin as paper, still holds. Historians still argue whether the British ever intended to extend citizenship to Black Africans after the war. The treaty's silence on the issue will echo for decades, shaping the racial policies that eventually become apartheid. The line between neglect and design is often too fine to see. By 1907, self-government is granted to the Transvaal and the Orange River Colony, promises kept from Vereeniging. The Boers regain control of their local parliaments, and former generals take seats as ministers. From rebellion to respectability, the newspapers call it. But no one mentions that the new laws quickly begin restricting black voting rights even further. The republics may be gone, but white supremacy survives them. And yet, something remarkable happens amid the contradictions. In 1910, just 8 years after the war ended, Britain unites its South African territories into a single dominion, the Union of South Africa. The former enemies, Boer and Britain, now share one flag, one government, one uneasy future. Kitchener is long gone by then, drowned at sea in 1916. Kruger is dead, buried in Pretoria under a monument that still smells faintly of gunpowder and sanctity. But the men who survived them, Botha, Smuts, and their generation, carry forward a nation built from ashes. You walk again through the veld, now green with spring grass. Birds return to the places where trenches once yawned. Cattle graze among the ruins of blockhouses, indifferent to history. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the land exhaling after 3 years of fire. The war is over, but its ghosts are everywhere. In the accents of farmers, in the scars on the hills, in the uneasy laughter between English and Afrikaans speakers at every tavern. The land remembers, because it always does. As the sun dips below the horizon, you realize something quiet but true. No empire lasts forever, but every nation is haunted by the price of its beginnings. The years drift on, and South Africa reshapes itself around the scars. It's the early 1910s now, barely a decade since the Treaty of Vereeniging, and the wounds of war have faded into ritual. The graves are trimmed, the blockhouses crumble, the flags change, but the memory refuses to die. You walk through Bloemfontein, now a tidy administrative capital under British rule. The railway station hums with traffic, soldiers in crisp khaki, Boer farmers selling wool, black laborers loading sacks of mealie. On the surface, life looks ordinary again. But if you pause long enough, you can still feel the fault lines beneath the cobblestones, the tension between pride and practicality, between survival and surrender. The Union of South Africa has been born, and with it comes an uneasy partnership between those who once tried to destroy each other. The Boers, now calling themselves Afrikaners, occupy parliament benches once reserved for their conquerors. Louis Botha, the old general, sits as the first prime minister. Jan Smuts, his comrade, serves as Minister of Defense and Interior. Together, they call for reconciliation, a word that feels noble in English and hollow in Afrikaans. Let us bury the past, Botha declares in his first address to Parliament. The hall applauds, but outside, in the dusty streets, veterans of both sides listen in silence. Some nod, others spit. Burying the past is easy when you still own the land. Harder when the land owns you. The British see the Union as proof of their genius for compromise. To them, it's the empire at its most enlightened, a former enemy turned partner. But to the Boers, it's more subtle, a strategic truce, a way to regain what they lost by playing the long game. We are still free men, one farmer says quietly, just under different paperwork. Historians still argue which side benefited more from this arrangement. Some claim Britain gained a stable dominion. Others insist the Afrikaners regained moral control of the land. Both are right, and both miss the point. The true cost was borne by those never invited to the table. The black majority remains invisible in the Union's grand design. They built the roads, mined the gold, herded the cattle, and bled for armies that never acknowledged them. Yet, when the Constitution of 1910 is written, their voices vanish like smoke. Voting rights are restricted almost entirely to whites. Segregation hardens into policy. You visit a rural township near Kimberley, where black miners live in tin shacks along the dusty road. "We carried their guns," one old man says, showing you a faded scar along his forearm. "Now they say we cannot vote because we are not civilized." He laughs, but it's the dry laughter of someone who's run out of disbelief. The mine siren wails in the distance, calling the night shift. The men shoulder their picks and lamps. The Empire needs gold again. The machine never stops. A quirky tidbit. The very barbed wire that once fenced the Boers into camps is now used by mining companies to fence in labor compounds. The irony is lost on no one, but no one dares say it aloud. Botha and Smuts travel to London for imperial conferences, where they're treated as equals among Dominion leaders. They walk through Whitehall in tailored suits, diplomats rather than rebels. The British press adores them. Gentlemen of civilization, they're called. The transformation is almost miraculous. The empire that once scorched their farms now toasts their statesmanship. Smuts especially fascinates the world. He's a philosopher general, quoting Goethe in one breath and designing military reforms in the next. In 1914, when Europe plunges into World War I, Smuts immediately pledges South Africa's support for Britain. "We fought them once," he says, "but we share their destiny." It's a shocking pivot. Boers who fought against the crown now leading armies for it. The irony doesn't escape anyone. One newspaper headline reads, "Old enemies now defending the empire they once defied." Historians still debate whether Smuts' loyalty was idealism or opportunism. Some say he believed in empire as a stepping stone toward global unity. Others see a man who learned that cooperation pays better than defiance. But for most South Africans, especially the rural poor, it's just another war fought for someone else's ideals. Meanwhile, Afrikaner nationalism simmers quietly in the background. Not everyone forgives, and not everyone forgets. Veterans from the war gather in farmhouses, drinking bitter coffee and speaking of betrayal. They see Botha and Smuts as sellouts, traitors to the republics of their fathers. They whisper of rebuilding the dream of independence, not through rifles this time, but through culture, language, and politics. Out of those whispers grows a movement, the National Party, founded in 1914 under J.B.M. Hertzog, another former Boer general. Its motto, South Africa first. Its goal, to free the country not from British soldiers, but from British influence. A quirky note? In their meetings, National Party members sing old psalms from the war, not for religion, but for memory. Each verse becomes both prayer and protest. You stand on a hillside outside Pretoria, watching a new monument rise. It's 1913, the 12th anniversary of the war's end, and Boer veterans have gathered to dedicate a memorial to their dead. The speeches are solemn, the hymns fierce. "We were conquered," one speaker says, "but not defeated." The crowd murmurs assent. In their faces, you see something the empire has never understood. Loss turned into identity. They will pass that inheritance to their children, and their children will wield it like a sword. Historians still argue whether the Boer War ended in reconciliation or reloading. What's clear is that beneath the veneer of unity, two South Africas are forming. One that dreams in English of progress and empire, another that dreams in Afrikaans of destiny and grievance. They share the same soil, but not the same memory. And still, the landscape endures. The veld that once burned is fertile again. Crops wave where trenches once gaped. The wind hums through eucalyptus groves planted to mark old battlefields. Life has returned, though not innocence. You walk the same ground where the Highland Brigade once charged into gunfire and think how absurdly quiet it is now. No screams, no drums, only the rustle of dry grass. You meet a young boy herding sheep nearby. He doesn't know what Magersfontein means, though his grandfather fought there. To him, the stone cairns dotting the ridge are just rocks, the kind that trap rabbits. History fades quickly when hunger and drought are closer concerns. But somewhere in town, his father still keeps a rifle hidden under the bed. just in case. That too is inheritance. By the time the Great War ends in 1918, South Africa has changed again. Smuts sits beside Woodrow Wilson at the Paris Peace Conference, drafting clauses about self-determination while conveniently forgetting his own country's black majority. Botha dies 2 years later, worn out by politics and compromise. Herzog ascends, preaching pure Afrikaner identity. The old alliances crumble. The reconciliation Botha promised dissolves into rhetoric. Yet beneath it all, the memory of the Boer War remains the quiet heartbeat of the nation. Every farm, every town still has someone who remembers. Mothers who lost children in the camps. Old men who fought in the commandos. Children who grew up in the ashes. They don't need history books. They lived it in their bones. When you look at South Africa now, barely 20 years after the first shots at Talana Hill, you see a country suspended between memory and modernity. The empire calls it progress. The Afrikaners call it patience. But the land, ever impartial, calls it balance. It absorbs everything: blood, gold, ambition, and keeps on turning green. The war was supposed to end things. Instead, it began everything that came after. You're standing on the open veld again, but the air feels different, older, heavier, as if every gust of wind still carries an echo of the gunfire that once defined it. It's the 1920s now, and the Second Boer War has already begun to slide from living memory into legend. The men who fought it are gray, their stories growing more polished with each retelling. What was once pain has become myth. What was once grief has become pride. In Pretoria, the Union Parliament meets in a stately building of white stone, modeled after British neoclassicism, but named in Afrikaans, Die Volksraad. The irony would make Kruger roll in his grave. Inside, English and Afrikaner politicians debate tariffs, railways, and labor laws. But underneath every speech lies the same unspoken question. Whose country is this now? The British think the answer is obvious. The Union, they say, is a model dominion, self-governing, loyal, industrious. South African gold funds their banks. South African troops guard their empire's borders. London still dreams of a seamless chain of crimson across the map. But in the farmlands, the Afrikaners think differently. They've turned defeat into a cornerstone of culture. Out of the ashes of the Boer republics rises a new identity, Afrikanerdom, defined not by victory, but by survival. Their schools teach history as hymn, brave farmers against impossible odds, faith against empire, loss as proof of chosen destiny. The war has become their exodus. A quirky tidbit: by the mid-1920s, Afrikaner choirs perform folk ballads about the sieges of Ladysmith and Kimberley in church festivals, treating them like psalms. One popular verse even refers to God's riflemen of the veld. You can almost hear it, drifting over the plains at dusk. Historians still argue whether this myth-making was healing or dangerous. Some call it cultural therapy. Others see it as the seed of nationalism. Both are right. Pain, after all, is the most efficient fertilizer for identity. Meanwhile, the black South Africans who tilled the same soil find themselves increasingly fenced off from its promise. The Natives Land Act of 1913, barely a decade after the war, has confined them to small reserves, about 7% of the country's arable land. It's the unspoken inheritance of Vereeniging's silence. You visit one of these reserves in the Transkei. The huts are tidy, the people proud, but the poverty is absolute. The land was not lost in battle, an elder tells you. It was lost in peace. His voice carries no anger, only fatigue. The British call it law. The Boers call it necessity. The people who actually live there call it theft. The irony is merciless. The Boers once fought to preserve their independence from British domination, and now they govern a system that denies independence to millions. History, it seems, has a cruel sense of symmetry. In 1924, Afrikaner politics finally break from English influence. The National Party, led by Herzog, forms a coalition with the Labour Party and takes power. Herzog promises to protect the poor white farmer, the small men crushed between gold barons and empire. But behind his campaign slogans lurks something deeper, the dream of an Afrikaans-speaking nation, purified of its colonial shadow. Street signs begin changing from English to Afrikaans. Schools shift their curriculum to emphasize Boer heroes, De La Rey, Botha, Kruger. Monuments rise in every town square. The war that once divided them now unites them, cast in bronze and marble. You attend one unveiling in Bloemfontein, where an equestrian statue of a commando leader towers over the crowd. The mayor gives a speech. We stand not as defeated sons, but as victors in spirit. The band plays a hymn. The crowd sings softly, eyes glistening. For a moment, it feels almost holy. But beneath the reverence is a shadow. This remembrance isn't about mourning anymore. It's about power. Memory has become a weapon, and soon it will be aimed not at Britain, but inward. Historians still argue whether the National Party's rise was inevitable. The economic hardships of the 1920s, the post-war depression, the collapse of small farms, certainly pushed it along. But ideology did the rest. The Boers' obsession with survival turned into a politics of exclusion. To preserve themselves, they began defining us and them with brutal precision. The British, for their part, gradually stepped back. By the late 1920s, they no longer try to control the Union. They just invest in it. The mines grow deeper, the profits larger, and London stays politely blind to what happens on the ground. Empire, after all, prefers its contradictions tidy. Smuts, now older and grayer, watches all this with increasing unease. Once the Empire's golden sun, he finds himself out of step with his own people. His appeals to unity fall flat. We must look forward, he says in a 1929 speech, not back to the ashes of old wars. But the crowd wants the ashes. They've built their identity upon them. You can almost pity him. A philosopher among partisans, a man too British for the Boers and too Boer for the British. His failure marks the twilight of imperial liberalism in South Africa. In 1938, as the centenary of the Great Trek approaches, Afrikaner nationalism reaches fever pitch. Across the country, reenactments of ox wagons rolling across the plains draw massive crowds. Women in bonnets wave the old Vierkleur flag of the republics. Children march barefoot, carrying wooden rifles. The war that ended in 1902 now feels like prophecy fulfilled. Proof that God preserved his chosen people for a destiny still unfolding. A quirky note, the organizers even transport a replica of the Covenant wagon from town to town. Its sides carved with verses thanking God for deliverance from the British oppressor. Tourists buy postcards. History becomes merchandise. You stand at one of these parades, watching as thousands of people cheer a past they've turned into theater. It's impressive and chilling at once. The pageantry smells of nostalgia and power. The crowd's chant rolls across the veld. Afrika vir die Afrikaner. South Africa for the Afrikaner. You wonder what the land itself would say if it could speak. Historians still argue whether this cultural revival was inevitable nationalism or a reaction to modernity. Industrialization was reshaping the country. Afrikanerdom offered stability, belonging, myth, and myths, as the 20th century will prove, are more durable than truth. By the outbreak of World War II, the past collides with the present again. Britain declares war on Germany, expecting its dominions to follow. South Africa hesitates. Herzog refuses. Smuts insists. Parliament splits. In a twist of irony so perfect it almost feels scripted, the decision to fight for the empire once more comes down to a single vote, and Smuts wins. The Union joins the Allies. British flags fly again, but without enthusiasm. In Pretoria, angry crowds burn Union Jacks in protest. Old Boers mutter that history is repeating itself, and they aren't wrong. The ghost of Kruger would find the whole thing grimly familiar. Smuts leads South African troops into North Africa and Italy. They fight bravely, earn praise from Churchill, and die far from home. Back in the Veld, Herzog's supporters rebrand themselves as the Ossawa Brandwag, or Oxwagon Guard, a quasi-fascist movement steeped in Boer romanticism and resentment. They plot sabotage against Smuts's pro-British government. You realize then that the Second Boer War never really ended. It just changed languages, flags, and uniforms. After the war, the world hails Smuts as a statesman. He helps found the United Nations and drafts parts of its charter. Yet back home, the tide has turned against him. His countrymen see him not as a visionary, but as a man who forgot who he was. In 1948, his party loses the election to the Nationalists, the same heirs of the Bitterenders who once swore never to bow to empire. The irony is brutal. The movement, born from resistance to British domination, now builds a system far darker. Apartheid, racial separation codified in law. The logic of purity and survival that began in the camps and commandos has come full circle. You look out across the Veld one last time, and the ghosts gather. They aren't soldiers anymore. They're farmers, miners, mothers, children. They ask the same question in a dozen tongues. Was it worth it? The wind answers, patient and wordless. History never replies. It only echoes. It's the 1950s, half a century since the Highland Brigade charged through that waterlogged field, and yet the echo of their boots still lingers somewhere in South Africa's soil. The empire that sent them is shrinking now. India gone, Ireland long lost, colonies blinking out like dying stars, and the country they fought to hold is changing shape once again. The Union of South Africa stands alone, proud and divided, a house built on compromise and denial. You walk the streets of Johannesburg and it feels like a city balanced on contradictions. Gleaming banks and office towers rise where muddy mining camps once sprawled. Gold still fuels everything, the lights, the railways, the nervous optimism. But beneath the wealth, the lines of separation harden daily. White and black, English and Afrikaner, rich and poor. Four nations pretending to be one. The old Boer War veterans are dying now, their medals dull, their stories fading into bedtime tales. Their grandchildren grow up in the world they left behind, speaking English in school, Afrikaans at home, and silence in between. The war that once defined the country has become a lesson in textbooks, a single page between Queen Victoria and Union formed. But memory doesn't vanish that easily. It only changes its disguise. The National Party, elected in 1948, wastes no time turning myth into policy. Its leaders, D.F. Malan, later Hendrik Verwoerd, believe they are fulfilling the destiny their forefathers earned through suffering. They invoke the Boer War often as proof that the Afrikaner spirit endures persecution. The concentration camps become sacred symbols, twisted into political justification. Never again shall our people be ruled by others, Malan declares. Not by Britain, not by blacks, not by outsiders. You can feel the irony like a chill down your spine. The war that once cried out for liberty now becomes the founding myth of oppression. What was memory of resistance transforms into machinery of control. Historians still argue whether apartheid grew more from fear or ambition. Some say it was revenge against humiliation. Others, a desperate attempt to preserve privilege in a changing world. Either way, its architects drew strength from the same sense of divine chosenness that once filled Kruger's republics. The language changed, the theology remained. In 1952, the centenary of Kruger's birth is celebrated with parades, sermons, and solemn vows. Children recite his speeches as if scripture. His portrait hangs in classrooms beside the flag of the Union, both watched over by a crucifix. God and the Volk, the teachers say. It sounds comforting until you realize who the Volk excludes. Meanwhile, the British descendants in the cities, bankers, bureaucrats, mine owners, pretend neutrality. They sip gin, read the Times, and assure themselves that apartheid is distasteful but necessary for stability. The hypocrisy smells faintly of imported cologne. A quirky tidbit. In 1954, an English newspaper ran a cartoon of Kruger shaking hands with Queen Victoria in heaven, both looking bewildered. The caption read, "So it worked out after all." The editors received death threats for weeks. And yet, not everyone forgets the other victims. A small circle of writers and reformers begins re-examining the Boer War, not as an imperial triumph or Afrikaner tragedy, but as shared human suffering. Olive Schreiner, long gone by then, is rediscovered. Her anti-war essays inspire a generation of liberals who believe South Africa might still find its conscience. University students read Emily Hobhouse's reports, horrified to learn that concentration camp wasn't invented by Nazis but by Victorians. At one lecture, an elderly woman in the audience stands and says quietly, "My mother was there." The room falls silent. History isn't as distant as it pretends to be. Historians still debate Hobhouse's place in South African memory. To Afrikaner nationalists, she was once a saint. Now she's inconvenient, a foreigner who reminds them that victimhood isn't virtue. To English liberals, she's a moral alibi, proof that someone, somewhere, cared. The truth lies between one woman who refused to look away. Out on the veld, the old blockhouses crumble completely. Farmers plow around them, their stones repurposed for sheep pens. The wire that once fenced prisoners now fences property. You stop at one ruin near Magersfontein, where goats graze between the foundations. A faded inscription reads, "Royal Engineers, 1901. The letters flake away with every rainstorm. You close your eyes and imagine the night it was built. Soldiers sweating under lantern light, hammering, muttering, cursing the endless emptiness. Now, only the wind remains, whispering through the same grass. A young Afrikaner farmer drives by in a truck, dust trailing behind. He waves, curious. When you tell him what you're looking at, he shrugs. Kitchener's bird cages, he says, using the old nickname for the blockhouses. We kept the wire, the British left, the land stayed. Then he drives off, leaving you alone with the ghosts. In the cities, time marches faster, the mines deepen, the factories multiply. Black workers pour in from rural areas, lured by jobs, trapped by laws. Passbooks, curfews, segregation. It all feels familiar, an echo of an older system of control. The barbed wire has returned, just under a different name. The government insists it's progress. Separate development, they call it. But even they know the truth. The empire's methods have simply changed hands. You read an editorial from 1955. The Afrikaner learned organization from the British and spirituality from adversity. The result is unbreakable. It's meant as praise. It sounds like a curse. Historians still argue whether apartheid was an evolution of imperial policy or its inversion. In truth, it was both. The child of British hierarchy raised on Boer trauma. It took the logic of empire and baptized it in national myth. In 1961, the Union becomes the Republic of South Africa, finally cutting formal ties with the British Crown. The newsreels show cheering crowds waving orange, white, and blue flags, the same colors once flown over Kruger's Republic. Prime Minister Verwoerd smiles from a podium. At last, our people are masters of their own destiny. But his destiny excludes millions. For the black majority, independence means nothing. They are still landless, voiceless, unseen. The freedom the Boers fought for has become a fence around someone else's life. You imagine Kruger's ghost watching from his bronze pedestal in Pretoria, lips twitching as if unsure whether to smile or frown. Perhaps he sees victory. Perhaps he sees irony. History rarely tells its protagonists which is which. A quirky detail. At the Republic's first military parade, a band of school children played Sari Mare, a folk song born in the war's concentration camps. The crowd sang along, oblivious to its origin. The melody that once mourned loss now celebrated power. And still, the land waits. The Veld doesn't take sides. It just absorbs. Rain falls on old battlefields and new prisons alike. Wheat grows through forgotten trenches. The same sun that once burned British soldiers at Colenso now glints off armored police vehicles in Sharpeville. The landscape remains constant. Only the uniforms change. You walk a final time through the high grass near Paardeberg, where Cronje surrendered and thousands died. The river murmurs beside you, indifferent as ever. A boy fishes nearby, barefoot, humming to himself. He doesn't know the name of this place, and maybe that's mercy. He just knows the fish are biting. Historians still argue what the Second Boer War meant. Imperial greed, national awakening, tragedy, transformation. But here, where the wind still carries the faint, metallic scent of history, all those arguments fade. What remains is something simpler. The proof that every war, once finished, begins again inside the people who survived it. The Empire came for gold and glory. The Boers fought for freedom. Both got something different: memory, guilt, and a country forever wrestling with itself. As dusk settles, you watch the horizon turn red. Not from fire this time, just the sunset bleeding across the Veld. For a moment, it's peaceful. Then the wind shifts, rustling the grass in a rhythm that almost sounds like marching. And you realize that peace, in this place, is never silent. It only hums between storms. The year is 1994, and a different kind of dawn rises over South Africa. A century has passed since the Boers first fired their rifles across the Transvaal border. The empire they fought has long vanished, and the system they built from its ashes, apartheid, has finally collapsed under its own weight. The world watches as millions queue under a blazing April sun, their fingers stained with purple ink, their faces shining with something the old generals would never have recognized: hope. You stand among them. The line stretches for miles outside a polling station near Pretoria. Men and women who once couldn't share a park bench now share this sacred weight. An old black man ahead of you leans on his cane, whispering a psalm in isiZulu. Behind him, a young Afrikaner woman in jeans offers him water. He accepts with a trembling smile. "First time," he says. "For both of us," she replies. The ghosts of the Boer War must be watching this moment, dumbstruck. The land that once bled for racial dominion is now teaching itself the vocabulary of forgiveness. When Nelson Mandela walks out of the polling booth, the crowd erupts. Not the roar of victory, but the release of a century's breath. In that sound, you can almost hear the unspoken question that's haunted this country since 1899. Can suffering ever lead to wisdom? Historians still argue whether Mandela's miracle erased or merely postponed the old war's legacy. On one hand, the Union Jack no longer flies here, and the republic that replaced it now belongs to all its people. On the other, inequality still runs along the same lines carved by empire and rebellion alike. The mine shafts still descend beneath Johannesburg. The profits still rise into distant hands. The trenches may have filled, but the divisions they marked never fully closed. You visit Bloemfontein again, that quiet city of stone and memory. Its museum now hosts exhibits on both the Boer and British sides, carefully balanced, like an apology written by committee. In one display case, a child's camp dress lies beside a rusted Lee Enfield rifle. The placard beneath reads, "Both victims of empire." A school group wanders through, chattering softly, half bored, half reverent. Their teacher stops before a photograph of Emily Hobhouse. "She helped us," he says, "but she also made them see." You realize he's right. For once, history is being taught not as sides, but as wounds. A quirky tidbit: Every year, the museum staff still light a single candle on the anniversary of the Treaty of Vereeniging, not to celebrate, but to remember silence itself, that uneasy stillness after surrender. Outside the museum, the statues remain. Kruger still stands on his pedestal in Pretoria, his bronze hand lifted toward a horizon that keeps changing. A few blocks away, a newer statue rises, Mandela, smiling, arms open. The two figures face opposite directions, separated by a century and ideology, yet both cast long shadows at sunset. The irony feels almost deliberate. You walk between them and think about how history in this country always rhymes rather than repeats. Each generation inherits the same fear in a new accent. Each victory hides the seed of its next tragedy. The Afrikaners, once conquerors of the Veld, now worry about their place in a multiracial democracy. The black majority, free at last, struggles against the economic chains forged during the wars their ancestors were never allowed to fight. The English descendants, comfortable in their suburbs, pretend the past is just history, when it's really geography. Every hill, every farm, every field still whispers the truth. Historians still argue about responsibility. Who lit the first match? The British Empire, with its greed and arrogance, the Boers with their zeal and exclusion. The truth, as ever, refuses simplicity. Everyone lost something they refused to share. You travel to Magersfontein, where the Highland Brigade fell that first December morning in 1899. The battlefield is quiet now, a heritage site, fenced by acacia and silence. A small stone cairn marks the British dead. A few yards away, a granite slab honors the Boer defenders. Between them, wildflowers bloom in yellow and white. A caretaker approaches, a middle-aged man in a sun-faded hat. "We get few visitors," he says. "Most people prefer Kruger Park to Kruger's War." He laughs softly at his own joke, then points toward the hills. "You can still find bullets after the rain," he adds. "The ground keeps spitting them up, like it can't digest them." That line stays with you. The land can't digest its history. It just recycles it, season after season, like topsoil. Farther north, near Paardeberg, the Modder River still snakes through the plains. Local farmers have learned not to till too deep. The soil there hides the bones of men and horses, tangled together. Every few years, the rains unearth a button, a coin, a buckle, a fragment of shrapnel. The farmers collect them quietly and bring them to the local museum. No one needs reminders here. They just need respect. A quirky story circulates among them. A Boer farmer once found a British bayonet in his field and used it for decades as a gate latch. "History should work for a living," he joked. In Pretoria, you visit the Voortrekker Monument, that massive granite fortress of Afrikaner memory built during the apartheid years. Its interior still glows with murals of ox wagons and heroic pioneers. But outside, on the broad steps, new plaques have been added since 1994, ones that speak of unity, reconciliation, and the shared suffering of all South Africans. A group of school children, mixed in race and language, stand before it, fidgeting as their guide explains the symbolism. "We remember so that we can move forward," she says. A little boy raises his hand. "Move where?" She smiles sadly. "We'll find out together." It's a small moment, but it feels like the truest kind of progress. Not triumph, not denial, just curiosity. Historians still debate how nations heal from wars that define them. Some argue through forgetting, others through confrontation. South Africa seems to be trying something harder, to hold both truths at once, to remember enough to understand, but not enough to hate. That night, you drive out into the veld. The air smells of dust and eucalyptus, just as it did a century ago. The stars spill across the sky like frozen gunpowder. You stop near a lonely windmill creaking in the dark and listen. The silence is thick, but it's not empty. It's full of the hum of life rebuilt again and again over the same wounded earth. If you listen closely, you can still hear them. The highland pipes drowned in rain, the Boer psalms whispered over open graves, the rumble of trains carrying prisoners and gold, the sigh of mothers in camps, the scratch of pens at Vereeniging, the first cheer when Mandela raised his hand. It's all one long, overlapping sound, a century of contradiction and endurance. A quirky fact? Somewhere near here, researchers found the seeds of wild aloe that hadn't bloomed since before the war. After the Veld fires of the 1990s, they sprouted again. The botanists called it a miracle. The locals just nodded and said, everything sleeps until it's ready. And so it ends where it began, with the land. The same red dust, the same horizon. Empires rise, republics fall, and still the wind moves across the plains, carrying the scent of burnt grass and the faint echo of horses' hooves. If you squint, you can almost see them. A line of weary soldiers trudging through the rain, a farmer commando kneeling in prayer, a child staring from behind barbed wire, a nurse lighting a lantern in a tent, a miner's pick striking gold, a student folding a ballot. One continuous line, one long march through history. The Second Boer War was supposed to decide who owned this land. 100 years later, the only answer that makes sense is that no one ever does. The land owns everyone in the end. Now, as the stars settle and the night cools, you take a breath and whisper the only benediction that fits this restless soil. Sleep, South Africa. Sleep and remember. And now, as the final echoes fade, let's slow everything down. The lights dim, the wind hushes, and the long century finally exhales. You've walked with soldiers through mud, with mothers through ash, with farmers through silence. You've watched nations rise from smoke and stumble again into shadow. Yet somehow, through all of it, life persisted, like grass pushing through cracks in stone. If you close your eyes, you can still smell the veld after rain, hear the creak of saddle leather, feel the rough calluses of hands that built and broke and rebuilt this place. History, in the end, isn't about winners or losers. It's about persistence, the refusal to vanish. The Boers endured, the British changed. The Black South Africans waited and fought and rose. Every generation added its verse to the same unfinished song. And tonight, you've heard it all. The grief, the pride, the contradictions, the small mercies. So let the dust settle now. Let the ghosts lie down. The empire's drums have long stopped, and the campfires of rebellion have gone cold. What remains is quieter but stronger. Memory, stitched into the soil, whispering that even the deepest wounds can grow new roots. Take a slow breath. Listen to the stillness. Somewhere out there, a windmill turns, the grass bends, and the night begins again. Sweet dreams.